Please join me in welcoming Larry Reed to the Sunflower State.
Okay. Thank you, James. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm thrilled to be here, and I congratulate KPI on its 20th anniversary. We at FEE have had opportunities to work with people who have been long associated with KPI. It's always an honor, and it's always great to be back here, too, to see so many old friends and familiar faces. It's an honor also to follow my friend Tom Palmer, who did me the very gracious favor of recommending my book, so I'm going to return the favor and recommend that you get his if you haven't already. Not only Self-Control or State Control, his latest book, but anything that Tom Palmer writes is always first rate. I'm going to talk to you today about real heroes, and I'm sort of taking off from this new book that came out only this week. I'm very happy to say that in the first 2 days of release, it went from, well, when it debuted on Amazon, I think the first number I saw was number 270,000 out of 8 million books. And that's not too bad, I guess, but it soared in the first 2 days to number 600 out of 8 million books. So we have a shot of, thank you. So we have a shot at being able to say that a FEE-related book has made it into the Amazon Top 100. So if you like it, I invite you to leave a review of it on Amazon. If you don't like it, then leave a review on Tom's book. But I just want to give you a taste of it today. We're very happy, as a token of appreciation for KPI's wonderful work, to provide KPI with 200 copies and for you to take. So I think we have enough, certainly for one per couple anyway, and maybe even more depending upon total numbers by the end of the day. So please, hope you don't leave the event without getting a copy of this, and hope you enjoy it. Well, why talk about heroes? Or what is a hero? I suppose I need to start by saying something about what a hero is. I suppose, too, that different people might give you different definitions. We all think of a hero as a person who maybe conducts a momentary feat of generosity or of life-saving. Somebody who saves a child from a burning home certainly qualifies as a hero. That's not the kind of hero, however, that I've decided to focus on in this book. I was interested in a little different category of hero. I was looking at people who lived not just moments of heroism, but lived lives of heroism. Not necessarily every moment of their life. In some cases, I write in the book about people who, by their own estimation, lived lousy lives for a time. But there came a moment when they transformed themselves, when they came to understand some eternal virtues and to practice them, and then lived lives of character and integrity thereafter. That's what I was looking for. I think this is important to liberty because, frankly, I don't know how liberty can arise or be sustained in the absence of the traits that I think define heroic character. I'm talking about character traits like speaking truth to power. I'm talking about courage. I'm talking about intellectual humility, the idea that you understand that no matter how much you may know, there is still a universe of knowledge out there that you don't know. I was just saying to someone a moment ago that when I have occasion to talk to young people, I like to open by saying something to the effect of, welcome fellow students, and use that as an opportunity to make the point that you're not, you shouldn't be just a student while you're in a formal classroom, but you should be a student all your life. Because even after decades of learning, and as much as you might know and as many degrees as you might have next to your name, there is still as much knowledge out there that you don't know as when you started. So I think we're called to be lifetime students. Also, I think a person of character who has the shot at rising to the level of a hero is one who practices responsibility. Tom Palmer talked about the importance of that. It's kind of the flip side of freedom. So those and many other traits are important in my estimation, and in this book, in explaining what a hero is. People who have lived lives of heroism through the choices they make, the examples that they set, and the objectives for their lives that they help advance through their actions and their decisions. Now I want to give you some actual examples from the book. The book covers 40 chapters. Each one focuses on a different hero, and they're not all from the United States, nor are they all from the present day. They go as far back as 2,000 years ago, and they encompass men and women from multiple countries in many different times of history. A few still living, I think 2 or 3 in the book, but the rest are from the past. The first one I want to talk about is my favorite Roman, the greatest of all defenders of the old Roman Republic, Marcus Tullius Cicero. There was a time in America when almost everybody who had any schooling at all knew who Cicero was. He was well known to America's founders. In fact, more is known of Cicero from his own writings than is known from their own writings of any other person who lived before the year 1000 AD. We have more of his letters and speeches surviving to this day than those of any other person in the world who lived before 1000 AD. When Gutenberg printed the Bible, that was his first product of his newly invented printing press in the mid-15th century, the Bible was his first publication, but the very second was a work of Cicero, De Officiis, in which he talked about such things as the role of government. He defined it as primarily the defense of property. Well, this goes back 2,000 years. Marcus Tullius Cicero was born in 106 BC. That puts him in the last century of the old Roman Republic. If you look at Roman history, you find it really, ancient Rome, that's a 1,000-year period. About 500 years was of the Republic, and the second 500 years was the period of the imperial autocracy or empire, the tyranny of the last 500 years of ancient Roman history. That's the period that most people seem to know more about, but it's the first 500 years, the Roman Republic, that I think gives us the greatest examples to emulate to this day. Cicero was born at a time when the old virtues of Roman liberty and of character, of responsibility, of fealty to the Constitution, of respect for the lives and property of their fellow citizens, plenty of exceptions. Rome wasn't perfect. Rome had slavery even. But nonetheless, it took liberty to a higher level than any previous civilization. But by the time of Cicero, that was breaking down. It was giving way increasingly to a welfare warfare state, something that Cicero stood firmly against and frequently spoke out in opposition to, and ultimately gave his life to try to stop. Cicero was a lawyer in his 20s and became rather well known early in his 20s when he defended a man who was accused of murdering his father. The reason that Cicero became so well known because of this case was that it turns out that the man was not actually the culprit, that the real culprit in the case, who had committed the murder, had ties to the highest levels of power in ancient Rome. So it took a lot for this young lawyer, Cicero, to take on the powers that be at this early age. He secured the acquittal of the defendant and became a celebrated young lawyer, celebrated for his oratory, for his research, for his diligence, for his commitment to the truth, for his willingness to speak truth to power. That's one of the great virtues of the heroes I write about in this book, that one of the great traits of heroism we need to encourage to this day and for all time. Well, 10 years later, as he is increasingly becoming better known as a very skilled lawyer, Cicero found himself on the other side of battle in the courtroom as a prosecutor in a very celebrated case whose details are still read in many law schools to this day. he was prosecuting a provincial governor, a very powerful man by the name of Verus, who was accused of people within his province of extortion and of corruption, and he was eminently guilty of these things. He thought he had the whole case wired because the judge of the extortion court was on his payroll, and he confidently thought that Cicero could easily be beaten and that he would be acquitted. But Cicero, once again, proved himself a diligent researcher, a courageous man who would stand up to power, and in fact presented a case that was so powerful that Verus himself fled the court and went into exile before the court could render its verdict, which it did, and it was guilty. Thereafter, Cicero worked his way up the so-called casus honorum, the ladder of power, you might say, being elected to almost everything that you could get elected to in ancient Rome, with a spotless record of integrity along the way. Ultimately, he became elected to the top position in Rome, that of co-consul. In the old Roman Republic, power was not concentrated in one man at the top. For nearly 500 years at this point, it had been broken up into the hands of two men at the top, and they were term limited, by the way, 1 year apiece. The decisions of one could be vetoed by the other. And you had a Senate, and you had popularly elected assemblies as well. Cicero ultimately becomes co-consul, the highest position in the ancient Roman Republic. And within weeks of assuming that position, he's confronted with a crisis. Within weeks, it's rumored that one of the more prominent senators in ancient Rome, named Catiline, was in fact conspiring to snuff out the Republic. And it turns out that, in fact, he was doing precisely that. He was amassing an army. His plans were to march on Rome, kill the two co-consuls, kill off a good portion of the Senate, and declare himself the dictator and snuff out the liberties of the Roman Republic. Cicero was given great power temporarily to bring this revolt to an end and to save the Republic, which he did. And then with all that power at his disposal, what did he do? What would so many other men do, having been given enormous power? So many would probably think, I kind of like this. Maybe I'll keep it. But like George Washington, like Cincinnatus, Cicero gave it back. When the job was done in timely fashion, he walked away from total power and became known as the father of the country, this late, in fact, in the Roman Republic. And when his year was up, he retired. And he continued to write and to speak on behalf of things like liberty and protection of rights and property. At the same time, Rome was falling apart. Factions are preying upon factions. You've got this guy, Julius Caesar, who's ultimately in 44 BC decides to make a move on Rome and to become its dictator. He actually secures the designation by the Senate of emperor for life. Some historians say it was at that point that Rome lost its republic. But he possessed that title for only a month until he was assassinated, as you well know. And there was a moment when perhaps the virtues of the old republic could be restored and saved. Cicero certainly did all that he could at that moment to try to see that that would happen. Mark Antony comes to power, and he seeks the total power that his predecessor had. And immediately, Cicero swings into action. He gave in the Roman Senate a series of 14 speeches, still well known, widely read in many quarters today, called the Philippics. 14 brilliant speeches attacking Mark Antony and the whole concept of the concentration of power. Mark Antony decides he cannot become Rome's dictator. He can't snuff out the republic without doing something about Cicero. So he names him officially an enemy of the state and dispatches an assassin to take him out. In December of 43 BC, the assassin found his mark, and Cicero was killed. And you might look back and say, well, how much good did he do? He may have staved off the collapse of the republic for a couple of decades, perhaps. But as I point out in the book, if I had an hour with Cicero, if I could go back in time, as I would love to do, and spend 1 hour with this man, I would want him to know what an incredible inspiration he is to this day, 2,000 years later. He spoke truth to power. He gave his life for what he knew to be right. And even though the outcome wasn't what he hoped, he inspired so many centuries later. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson quoted Cicero frequently, referred to him as the master of the world, of the ancient world. A great man we have a lot to learn from. I think one of the tragic commentaries of our day is that his name is not well remembered by students who are graduating from high school or college, and yet he's one of the greatest defenders of liberty the world has ever known. Well, moving on, I want to give you a few other samples of the heroes I talk about in the book. Adam Smith is another. Adam Smith is a hero. Now, he didn't achieve his heroism by battle on the battlefield, but he certainly was a hero in terms of his eloquence and his ability to persuade and to change the world. He left the world a better and freer place because of the magnificence of his oratory, in the written word in any event, in The Wealth of Nations, which made its appearance in 1776. I don't know if you know the full title of that book. It's not The Wealth of Nations. We abbreviate it that way, but it's an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And I like to point out that I think there's an important lesson to be learned by that title. Did you notice that he didn't entitle it An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Poverty of Nations? And yet, it's poverty that we talk so much about these days, right? If Smith were here today, and if you were to ask him, why were you inquiring into the wealth of nations? Weren't you interested in poor people and poverty? I have a feeling that he would answer that question this way. I think he would say, poverty is no secret. It's what happens when nothing happens. It's the natural state of things until you do something about it. It's wealth that solves the problem of poverty. And that's what we need to study. Don't study poverty, study wealth creation. And then you will, by definition, learn a great deal about how to expunge the scourge of poverty. So he was interested in finding out, how do we go from a society of primitive people with short lifespans and so forth to a society of wealth? Where does it come from? And Adam Smith showed us so eloquently, for the first time in history. There were people before who had written a little bit about economics here and there, but it was always an isolated compartment of something called moral philosophy. Smith brought it all together and put it in a book that was systematic in its approach and rightfully can be known as the father of economics. Smith said, look, this idea that we've had for centuries that the world's wealth is fixed, that there's only so much of it, a lot of people thought that at the time. That the pie is fixed, and therefore if you want to get more, you got to find somebody who's got some of it and just take it from them. Colonize, take over, send armies, confiscate. Smith said that's ridiculous. The way you bake a bigger pie is through such things as the division of labor, investment, taking risks, entrepreneurship, the creation of wealth. And he explained this so vividly. We take it for granted today, many people. But at the time that he wrote this was a very notable achievement to express this simple concept as being profoundly important to the course of human progress. He did that magnificently. But he also went further and explained that money, even the best forms of money, gold and silver, are not wealth. They are claims to wealth, but ultimately, he explained, it's goods and services that are wealth, that make a nation wealthy. So if you want to make a nation wealthier, what you do is you put policies and practices in place that increase the likelihood that people will invest, take risks, open businesses, and engage in free trade. Adam Smith did this job of explaining the basic elements of a free economy so well and maybe they came along at just the right time with the world sick of hundreds of years of mercantilism and feudalism before that they fell on fertile ground, that he had profound influence. It was because of Adam Smith and some of his followers like Frederick Bastiat, who's also a chapter in the book, in the years after Smith, that gave birth to the 19th century's massive growth in freedom and free market economics. And so I count him as a hero that in too many places has been forgotten, and yet a man who made it possible for so many problems to be solved in the century after he wrote. I also have a chapter in the book about Andrew Mellon. Andrew Mellon was one of 76 Treasury secretaries in U.S. history, and I think the best of them all, the best of all 76 Treasury secretaries. Only two men in our history served longer times as Treasury Secretary than Andrew Mellon. He was in the office under 3 presidents and for almost 11 years. Warren Harding first appointed him, which itself was an interesting little story because, at that point, Andrew Mellon was one of the richest men in America, number 3, I believe, behind John D. Rockefeller and Henry Ford. So he was already well known, a key figure in the Alcoa Company and in so many other industries like shipbuilding and so forth. Warren Harding sent word that he'd like him to apply for the Treasury Secretary position. He had to go to Marion, Ohio to meet the president-elect. And when he got there, you'd think a man of his stature would have sort of worked his way to the front of the line or said, "Hey, excuse me, I'm Andrew Mellon." He was a humble guy. He stood in line for several hours. And when he finally got to the president's house and they realized who he was, the president-elect's aides were just deeply embarrassed that they'd have Andrew Mellon waiting all this time, but that was fine by him. As a man of character, he wasn't about to butt in line in front of the other applicants for various positions to be interviewed. Well, he was a man who understood things like incentive. And from the day he took office, he worked on Harding and Coolidge and secured their support for substantial reductions in tax rates. This man reduced or secured the reduction of the estate tax by 50%, from 40% down to 20%. He pushed for its abolition, couldn't get it through Congress, but at least he cut it in half. Top tax rates, income tax rates, had already gotten as high as 73%. Keep in mind, this is just a few years after the income tax was adopted in 1913. And during that debate, you had people who scoffed at the idea that the top rate would ever go beyond 10%. And here it is less than a decade later, and the top rate, thanks to Woodrow Wilson, was 73%. And Andrew Mellon said, hey, that's causing capital to go into flight. People are putting their money elsewhere, or they're putting it in sterile tax shelters. And he noted that even John D. Rockefeller's son was not buying Standard Oil stock. He was putting his money in Treasury securities. So he said, we need to stop that. We need to have capital go into productive lines of endeavor, and let's bring those tax rates down. When he was done, he had brought the top rate from 73 down to 25%. All the other rates, the income tax, were dramatically reduced as well. Federal spending, by the time Coolidge left office, was actually lower than it was when Andrew Mellon first became Treasury Secretary. A good friend of mine, Burton Folsom, great historian, did a little calculation, and he discovered that Andrew Mellon also reduced the size of his own department, the Treasury office. He reduced the Treasury Department by, on average, 1 employee for every day of the 10 and a half years he was Secretary of the Treasury. Remarkable man. Now, isn't that great? Yeah. Franklin Roosevelt didn't like this guy. And as the book points out, he went after Mellon with a vengeance, never could secure a conviction for anything. And there are a lot of folks I quote in here, even an IRS director who said this was a White House witch hunt under Roosevelt to try to show that Mellon was a bad guy, but in fact he wasn't. And also one of the greatest philanthropists in American history, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. is the direct result of Andrew Mellon's benefactions. Well, I want to quickly touch on a couple others. We have a few minutes yet? Okay, I'll kind of make them short, but I want to tell you about Vivian Kellums. How many remember who Vivian Kellums was? Okay, yeah, wonderful woman. Golly, I wish I'd met her. This woman was an incredible inventor and businesswoman. In the 1920s, along with her brother, she invented what became known as the Kellums cable grip. It was used to transport or to carry heavy cables. Later, she adapted it for use in World War II to carry artillery shells, and had some major contract work with the U.S. government during World War II. And even though we were at war, and you might suspect or might expect that she would kind of keep quiet if she saw malfeasance within government, boy, she spoke out. She said, hey, the War Department's full of waste and abuse and fraud. I can't believe it. And so the Roosevelt administration went after her too because of her outspokenness. But she's probably best known for after the war when withholding became compulsory. Employers being required to withhold taxes from their employees and pay it up to the federal government. She came out against that with a vengeance. She gave a speech in Chicago announcing her opposition to compulsory withholding, and she famously said, speaking of Harry Truman, the president then, she said, if high tax Harry wants me to be a tax collector for him, he'd better put me on the payroll and I want a badge. And her point was that employers should not be unpaid tax collectors for the government. And furthermore, the government shouldn't be sneakily taking money from employees little bit by little bit. They ought to send them a bill once a year so they have a better sense for what the real cost of government is. Now, this is a battle, of course, she ultimately lost. But, wow, kudos to her for fighting it as long as she did. One particular battle she did win. She won several, but the other one I want to tell you about is she was no friend of intrusive government at any level. Her factory was in Stonington, Connecticut, and she had hundreds of employees, and they were famously loyal to her. Many women worked in her factories. And the Connecticut legislature passed a law I forget the year, but I think in the 50s, in which it said no woman in Connecticut can work after 10 p.m. And, well, Vivian Kellums didn't have a night shift, so you might say, well, no skin off her nose, it wouldn't have affected her, but she was a principled woman. She said, this is no business of the Connecticut legislature to tell women when they can and when they can't work. So what she did to defy it and to try to challenge the law was she rounded up hundreds of her female employees to show up for a night shift. And she held a press conference and said, come and get us. And she wanted the cops to come so that she could challenge this and have standing in court. Well, they didn't. They didn't want to tangle with this scrappy woman. So she was frustrated by that. She said, where are the cops, you know? And so what she did was this. This multimillionaire, successful businesswoman decides she's going to get a job as a waitress at an all-night cafe. And she did, and she basically said, come and get me. And within 2 days, the Connecticut legislature voted to repeal the law that she had stood up against. So. Well, I don't have time to tell you about another guy, but the one chapter in here is about the bravest man I've ever come to know. His name was Witold Pilecki, and if you don't read any other chapter in the book, I hope it'll be the one about him. Because there's no braver man that I've ever come across than Witold Pilecki. So with that, I know we're going to move into our next session, so I say thank you for being so attentive. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Have a seat.
Thank you.
So we're not chasing Tom and Larry off quite yet. We're going to let all of us kind of be the proverbial fly on the wall as they have a conversation, kind of tying together the two speeches that we just heard. They have been briefed, as it were, knowing that a prompt is coming, but this is our chance just to kind of observe from them and listen. If they bogged down, run out of things to say, which seems unlikely given the two of them, we may solicit some questions from the audience. And if we get to that point, I would just beg of you a favor. One, raise your hand. We'll have a mic going around. And this same rules will apply for later on when we do the panel discussion. Let's keep the dissertations to a minimum. Try to have a short, succinct question so that we can keep moving along. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Tom and Larry. The question we kind of queued you up with was, you've been doing this, I think, Tom, you said for 4 years, not 40. And Larry has been doing it for 40 years as well. So then the question is, why have you dedicated your lives to this? And then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Okay, I'll admit it's been over 40 years. One of the things that I think is important is identity, to be the person that you want to be. And that's part of the reason why I worked on this book. It took me a long time. Other books, I try to crank them out. My goal is 1 book a year, and I want to write another 100 of them. But this one took 2 years because I spent a lot of time reading and thinking. And this idea of becoming the people we want to be is very important to liberty. We don't need liberty just to indulge the current impulses we have, which is the vision enemies of liberty have. We need liberty to become the people that we want to become. And my vision of myself is to be the person who's willing to stand up for the freedom of other people. So my freedom is under threat as yours is, but I don't face the threat most of the people I work with do, of religious persecution or arbitrary arrest or execution in other countries. And I want to be a friend of liberty, which means to love the freedom of other people, which I think is what it means to be a friend of liberty. It's not about just me, me, me. It's about respecting other people and respecting their equal rights. So that's what has motivated me in my life. When I was very young, I grew up with stories of National Socialism and fascism and communism, and they were so horrifying. I said that no one should live under that. And then I had the experience in the Soviet Union of meeting really brave people, many of whom could have been in Larry's book as well, who stood up for what was right and suffered for it as a consequence. And when I think of them, those are the people who inspire me.
I think that probably the most important thing in life, number one, is getting your spiritual life in order, your relationship with your Creator, but very close behind it is your personal liberty, because I just can't imagine life without it. Can you imagine life without liberty? That would mean somebody else is living your life. That would mean you couldn't truly be who you are, because you wouldn't be in charge of yourself. And the first time I ever really came to appreciate this was in 1966. I was 13. Some of you, I know Ethel May from Missouri knows this story, but my mother said, we're going to go up to Pittsburgh to see this new movie, The Sound of Music. And I remember not wanting to go because I thought, what's this? You know, a bunch of people dancing around, singing. You know, why would I, at 13 years of age, want to do that or see it? But my mother said, but it's a true story. You need to see this. And I was enthralled. And looking back on it, I realized, you know, the way that hit me is as follows. I went into it not knowing what it was about, except that it was a true story. And I learned about this family who hadn't harmed anybody. The father was being drafted by a foreign regime into its military, and that foreign regime was about to swallow up this country. I didn't know any of this history, but I felt immediately sympathetic. I felt like, wow, there are people in the world in times past, if not present day, who don't enjoy the kind of liberties we have here. I want to read more about this. So I devoured everything I could after seeing that movie about pre-World War II history. And then that really came to fruition in 1968. So you can imagine this was like 2 years of reading, even William L. Shirer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, that 1,500-pager. Next door, not in Austria, but in Czechoslovakia, you had a profoundly important event that year, Prague Spring, where Czechs began to exert their desire to be free of the Soviet Empire. And I thought, hey, I want to cheer those people on. I watched that. I saw it on the news every day. I was aware of so many people in the world saying, hey, maybe the Soviet Union won't let this happen. They're going to invade, as they have in the past in Hungary and East Germany. And I remember vividly in August of '68 when Brezhnev of the Soviet Union met with Dubček of Czechoslovakia, and they had this big conference, and Brezhnev basically said, oh, we wouldn't invade, let's just talk, you know. And then 3 weeks later, it was about 10 o'clock at night in our home near Pittsburgh, when my father motioned for me to come in and listen to his radio, first reports of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And I still get goosebumps when I think of that, of tanks and troops invading a country. Why? Because these people want to be free. That's not right. So within days, there was a little story in the local newspaper that a group called Young Americans for Freedom was going to have a demonstration in downtown Pittsburgh to protest this. I said, I'm going to get a bus ticket and go back up there to Pittsburgh and join in. And I did, and we burned a Soviet flag, and I got on the YAF mailing list, and the first thing that you started to get on a regular basis was a subscription to The Freeman, published by the Foundation for Economic Education. But also they sent Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, and The Law by Frederick Bastiat, all the great works of freedom literature, and I was immediately hooked. And so that's how I got into this, but it really comes down to the desire to help people be what they are meant to be, free, sovereign individuals, free to run their lives so long as they do so peacefully.
And I had a plug. First off, of course, I'm wearing this jacket in honor of the Von Trapp family, great heroes of liberty. But the second thing is, FEE was also my gateway. And what a wonderful organization. I'm really proud to be indirectly associated with FEE. I was on the board for a couple of years, and I send them money occasionally. It's a great organization, and one of the great things is they have a timeless message that is kept up with technology. They're even on Snapchat, whatever that is. And so they keep up with how people communicate these days so that they're in touch with new generations to impart ancient wisdom. And I really, really love FEE. And,
Thank you, Tom.
I so admire what Larry and his colleagues have done there.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to raise, you mentioned Vivian Kellums, and I do remember her. She was an amazing person. Must be some other people here who remember Vivian. Ethel May? Yes, okay, I thought so. She was really remarkable person. There's another lady from Connecticut, Rose Wilder Lane. How many of you have heard of her? A couple more hands. What an amazing person. She was also an intrepid entrepreneur, and that's, I mentioned this, why I don't like the idea of rugged individualism. These were ladies. They were tough. They were businesswomen and writers and so on, but they were also feminine and delicate and great individualists. And Rose had been a young communist-oriented thinker. She said, this is fabulous. Communism will save the world. I will go to the Soviet Union and learn how it's working. And she did. And she came back to warn the world about the horror that she had seen building there, and dedicated her life to warning people about collectivism, all kinds of collectivism, Nazism and fascism, anti-Semitism, communism, and so on. And what a brave person she was. She's also someone to read. And I'm going to send Larry my extremely rare copy of her book about Albania, which she visited. She was proposed to by King Zog. And at the time, he was Muslim, and she said, well, I'm not sure. She was worried about being wife number one. And so that did not appeal to her. And so she turned him down. He married another beautiful American lady and never married anyone else. But she was an amazing figure in the movement for liberty, an exciting adventurous, and also she really understood freedom. I recommend her writings very, very highly. And it is a corrective to, again, that image that somehow being an individualist means being unconnected to people, or cold, or uncaring, or rugged, or masculine. You can be those things and be an individualist, not a very good one. She was a loving, caring person who was brave and very much a lady during her lifetime. I'd like to ask, what about some of the other heroes? Because I got to say, Larry's book is really good. So after you finished mine, you should dig in to Larry's book. Why don't you mention two more of your most favorite people? Because I like this book. The stories are great and well told.
Okay, Ludwig Erhard is a chapter of the book. Tom and I are fellow members of an organization that he was a member of, the Mont Pelerin Society. Ludwig Erhard was an economist, and during the years of Nazi Germany, he was in trouble from time to time from the Nazi regime, especially when he later started to talk about what a post-war Germany should look like. He lost positions because of his outspoken advocacy for free markets, not the socialism of the Nazi regime. But it was after the war that he became so well known and made such an impact on Germany and world history. Just imagine the situation in post-World War II Germany in the late 40s, a country that was defeated, devastated, occupied, divided, 1 million refugees pouring in, just having gone through not only a devastating war, but a decade and a half of socialism. It was on its back in every way. And Erhard worked his way up through the bureaucracy during Allied occupation to the point where he was able to do something dramatic. On a Sunday in, I believe, 1947, Erhard went on the radio to announce to the German people that all the vestiges of socialism that had been crippling the economy for so long were going to be thrown out the window, and that overnight he was abolishing price controls, he was introducing a new sound currency, he was getting rid of rationing. He made the comment on the air that your ration coupon now is called the German mark. It's going to be a new sound currency. And he gave birth to what became known as the post-war German economic miracle. Within a decade, this defeated, devastated, flattened, occupied country became the economic powerhouse of Europe. And there was a great moment when Erhard was confronted by the General Lucius Clay, the leading American in charge of the American occupying force. He came in Monday morning after that big announcement, and he said to Mr. Erhard, he said, "My advisors tell me that you have made a mistake with all this freeing up of the economy." And Erhard's reply was, "Don't pay any attention to them, General Clay. My advisors tell me the same thing." And then General Clay said, "Well, tell me, why have you altered our controls?" And his famous response was, "I haven't altered them. I've abolished them." And I think at that point, the American occupation was winding down, and we didn't intrude. We just said, okay, let him do what he wants. And then the miracle happened. So anytime anybody tells you that, well, there's not an example where a free market made a big difference. Well, here's the worst possible case that a man could inherit. The mess of socialism and war combined. He resorts to freedom and free markets, and bingo, it works beautifully within a decade.
Mention a compliment to that. I commissioned a paper, a chapter for an earlier book I did, which you can get, called The Morality of Capitalism, After the Welfare State, on Italy. Italy had a similar story, but it's not as well known. Luigi Einaudi, another Mont Pelerin Society member, had been an anti-fascist figure in Italy, and he became the first president of the Republic after the war. And they had 10 years of solid free market policies that created, in Germany, the Wirtschaftswunder, but in Germany, the Miracolo Economico, the economic miracle. And Italy went from a defeated, crushed, backward, stagnant nation. They abolished the fascist economic controls, freed their economy, and you've heard the phrase, the good life, the sweet life, that was characterized the life in Italy at the time. It had a fantastic rate of economic growth, thousands and thousands of new companies formed, a really astonishing success story, and then they started to think, well, we had those policies, they gave us all that prosperity, we're so rich, we have a young population, we can afford to generate a welfare state, which they did. And now, those young people aren't so young anymore. And now they're broke. And it is a very important case about how Einaudi had the courage to do the right thing, abolish the fascist economic controls, the corporatism, and so on, freed the economy, and then later generations didn't realize why they were rich. They didn't understand. That is one of the biggest challenges we face. Most people don't know why we're wealthy. They just assume that's just how the world is. But it doesn't last forever. You can turn into Argentina. Just ask the Argentines. That's what happened to them. Once one of the richest countries in the world, and they crashed and burned because of terrible economic policies, because people forgot why they were rich. And we need to remind people what are the sources of our prosperity. The last point I would mention in that regard, that I find one of the biggest obstacles to sound policies in foreign countries is the US government. Because we send lots of advisors, like they did to Germany, and they say, whoa, 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 you can't let people just buy and sell stuff. That would be chaos. They'd buy and sell stuff at whatever prices they agreed on, and that can't work. So you need all of these controls, all of these government agencies, and so on, which are designed by our bureaucrats and those of the European Union and other countries. And I stress to people in poor countries, I say, do not ask what rich countries do now. Ask what did they do when they were becoming rich. Now, wealthy countries can afford stupid policies because we're rich. Poor countries cannot, because when you're on the margin of existence, it means your children die. It means you suffer. You cannot afford the bad policies of wealthy countries. You need to ask, what did rich countries do when they were becoming rich? And the answer is free markets and property.
I saw a hand in the back.
Yep, right back here. Yes,
Or
sir?
a couple questions.
Well, as you know, a lot of the universities and state universities espouse liberalism and socialism, and they're predominantly liberal and socialist. What do you think about the taxpayers having a say in who gets hired? For example, can the state legislatures make a requirement that if you have 2 liberal professors, you ought to have at least 1 conservative professor? And what do you think about these safe places that these universities have to limit free speech?
Let me mention very quickly, and Larry has thoughts on this, I'm sure, as well. I think it's a mistake to demand safe spaces for conservatives. And that's the problem. If we just adopt their approach and say, you can't criticize us, you hurt our feelings, or we should have our protected areas, we are actually letting them win the battle. And it's a battle that we cannot continue to fight on their terms. They will defeat us. So I think that would be a mistake. The question of how to address it is a difficult one, and there are groups that do. FEE is on college campuses all the time. Students for Liberty is a group I also support. It's wonderful. They're all over. I love these kids for what they're doing. I'm a big fan of Students for Liberty. Institute for Humane Studies. And there's a new group, which you could look up online, called heterodoxacademy.org. And it's made of professors, some of whom are from the left, by the way, but they're honest people who say, we have created a monoculture where we cannot be criticized. This is not healthy, that we drive alternative viewpoints out of the academy. It's not good even for us. We need to be challenged. And heterodoxacademy.org is a great place to look. And the good news is that there are plenty of left-of-center thinkers adding their voices saying, we want a more authentic diversity. And authentic diversity means people actually sometimes disagree. So that, I think, is probably more fruitful approach. But Larry, what do you think?
Well, I share your frustrations. And that's a big reason why at FEE, though we work with lots of friendly professors in getting our message into their classrooms, we also actively work around the unfriendly ones and go directly to the students, which is easier to do today, frankly, with the internet and social media than it's ever been before. But I don't think that the fruitful approach would be to pass laws to sort of make sure our guys get in charge. And for a number of reasons. One is that by our very nature as conservatives, as libertarians, you know, when we get involved with government, it's like we're getting our hands dirty, you know. And so we might do it for a time, but then we go back to the productive private sector. And that's what would likely happen. Maybe we'd, you know, force a few good people to be hired, but then too many of us would say, oh, well, job is done, now let's, and before you know it, the other side is fully in charge. I think the best way to deal with this is twofold. Aside from what I already said, working around the unfriendlies through other media. But one way is to encourage alternatives to the traditional bricks and mortar state university educational system, whether it be private colleges or new methods like Praxis. If you check that out online, you'll find it's an alternative to the traditional college approach. You don't have to go to college to succeed in life. This is a cheaper, non-debt-ridden way to get it done so that you can progress in life without all that rigmarole and expense of a college education. But also, ultimately, I think we ought to be liberating the taxpayer from having to support universities. I don't think that's a proper function of government in any event. And so I think ultimately we need to make the case to people that education is too important to be dependent upon politicians at any level, including universities.
We have a question from up here.
Hello. My question is a little bit more specific to Mr. Palmer, but could be for either. You mentioned your book, After the Welfare State, and I remember one thing that I found particularly interesting in that book was your mention of mutual aid societies, which existed to a greater extent before the welfare state. I've had conversations with people who just simply don't believe that they can work. So my question is, where's the best place to go for data or empirical examples or arguments for why mutual aid societies can work as an alternative to the welfare state?
Well, that's a great question, almost as if I had planted it. There are a couple chapters in that book, After the Welfare State, which you can actually download as an ebook. If you search for it, After the Welfare State, it's on Smashwords, another social media platform I don't understand. Or just search After the Welfare State PDF and you'll find it. And I commissioned some chapters, so that's been a great interest of mine for years. In the Soviet days, this issue came up and I commissioned a British historian, David Green, to write a book which we published in the Russian language and others. There's a lot of historical material and you'll find lots of footnotes in those chapters. The David Beito, B-E-I-T-O, professor at University of Alabama, has written extensively on this. It's a wonderful, actually uplifting story. And one of the exciting things is African Americans and other minority groups were more likely to be engaged in these societies, who took care of themselves, took care of their neighbors. Why? Because the state excluded them. They were the deliberately marginalized. No one would take care of them. They took care of each other. And there's a very robust history, especially in African American communities, of this. It's been hammered by the welfare state, but groups like the Prince Hall Masons, as an example, a really heroic and inspiring organization, when black people were excluded from Masonic orders, contrary to their own principles for years, they set up their own, named after Prince Hall, the founder, got a charter. And this organization has been a great source of stability in America's black communities. So there's a long history of this, and it's full of inspiring people. We were talking at dinner about Dr. T.R.M. Howard, founder of the National Medical Association. A more inspirational person you cannot imagine. He was a great American. He was one of the important figures in the early civil rights struggle against lynching and against murder of black people in this country, and he believed in self-reliance, in private business, and mutual aid. We take care of each other voluntarily. And as they said, to reject the cold hand of public charity for the warm hand and embrace of your neighbors. And that, I think, is the way forward. But it's very well documented, albeit not taught in most university courses.
One more quick question.
If you go back a century in this country, what we now call social programs were taken care of primarily by two rather disparate groups. Churches, for one thing, and political parties, immigrant groups, Swedes, Finns, that kind of thing. And they did a pretty good job, but government programs say, that's no good, we've got to do it, we know better. How do you handle something like that? And how do we get back to what it used to be if that's an appealing prospect?
Well, one thing to consider, some of these organizations are still with us, and I'll mention one I talked about my brother today at lunch that some of us may have had contact with. It's Alcoholics Anonymous. It's a mutual aid society that's oriented towards people who struggle with alcoholics. There's also Narcotics Anonymous, and they help each other. One of the things that I learned, I can't really help an alcoholic myself if I'm not one. It's very hard. I don't understand all the struggles they go through, and other alcoholics do. And when they help each other, they're much stronger. It's not perfect. It doesn't work 100% of the time, but it does work better than government rehabilitation clinics. And tyrants fear Alcoholics Anonymous. It is crushed and suppressed in Russia because it's an independent civil society organization. So these do exist. Those organizations can be quite helpful, and what we need to do is resist the government colonizing them. It's a very bad thing that courts have been sentencing you to AA. I think it's terrible. AA needs to be a voluntary organization, and similar groups like that. So I think it is possible. There are mechanisms, Cato Institute and others explore these, how to diminish reliance on the welfare state and enable these other groups to fill the space if the state retreats. And the actual experience is they do a better job. If the standard is perfection, people say government should do it because they're magical. They never fail, right? They always do a good job because you pass a law that says everyone will be taken care of, so they are. It's, I think at a deeper level, it's because they believe in magic. And I don't.
I certainly agree with that. And I would add this, that I think we need to be more creative at shattering myths, at getting people to think in different ways. And on this particular issue, here's one effective tool that I've used, and it's not peculiar with me. I've seen others do it too. And that is to ask people why it is that those who seem to worship the state, think that the state is the answer to everything, always advocating more of it, why is it that that's not reflected in their own personal habits? Do you know any big government liberals who themselves write out checks that they don't have to the Department of Health and Human Services? I mean, if they think government handles these social problems better, wouldn't they be big philanthropists to government, eager to pay more than their taxes require, writing out checks to the... And yet, if they give it all, they too, like the rest of us, give to help people. We give to Salvation Army, Red Cross, you know. If you suddenly came into a windfall of $10,000 and you decided, I'm just going to use this money to help people, would it even occur to you to write out a check to the Department of Health and Human Services? Well, why is that? Why is that? Is it, don't they do such a wonderful job? Press these people on this question and ask them why their own personal habits don't comport with the ideology that they preach. There must be good reasons for it. And in fact, there are.
Thank you, Tom and Larry.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom.